This is a sermon about the Trinity. This is not a sermon about divine mathematics. This is not a sermon about theological vocabulary exercises. It's also not a sermon about smoothing out Trinitarian doctrines so that they square sensibly with monotheism. Because frankly, the Trinity isn't sensible. This is a sermon about the beauty and the delight offered to us who believe in a God who is first, always, and simply more. It is the feast of the Trinity, if an idea can have a feast day, and the text and the stories dance around the imagery of God and Son and Spirit or wisdom. When we get started talking about the Trinity, one of the first mistakes that we make is to go to Scripture to look for evidence. It's a mistake not because the evidence isn't there, it is, but because we go looking for small proof texts, only hunting for the word wind over here or the word flame over there. Instead, we might read Scripture from start to finish, as always pushing the boundaries of human imagination to remember that God will continuously move beyond our little formulations. Instead, when we read the sacred stories with this Trinitarian viewpoint, we see all over the place the constant and consistent reminder that our imaginations are limited and that God's nature is uncontainable. Every line of every story offered today blows open and past our expectations. Wisdom can be found at the crossroads, in the city and outside the city, once upon a time and today, in the soil and the sea, and limits and delight. God is then the course setter for stars and moon, and of oxen and birds. The peace and grace of God are found in triumph and in suffering. God's huge love is poured into each tiny heart. Jesus is right that we can almost not bear it all, that the expansive truth of God's glory is just about too much. Again and again, we discover that as soon as we decide God is one way or another, or that God is revealed here but not there, we're confronted with the truth that God is simply and always more. And here's why this Trinitarian idea of complexity and moreness matters so much, not just today, but every day. Because we live in a world dominated and domineered by a narrative that is crushing in its small-mindedness. The almost singular message of media and politics and technology is that we ought to be afraid that we won't get enough of scarce resources, afraid of each other, afraid of the future. This surround sound content suggests that the world is bleak and competitive, and that we are each alone and isolated. There's a palpable feeling being sold to us of shrinking horizons and limited dreams. The urging of this narrow vision, we might be tempted to hunker down, grab what we can, and look warily upon our neighbors. Turning inward is such a strong temptation, matching that small-minded siren song. And in such a manufactured so-called reality of rugged individualism, we might just begin to believe that everyone really is just in it for themselves, and so we ought to be too. And then, along comes this awkward and fiddly idea of the Trinity, of more. More God in more places, in more ways than we can even talk about with regular ideas and straightforward language. In the face of scarcity, we literally get too much glory to make sense of, too much truth to even bear. Instead of loneliness and individualism, we get a God who is best glimpsed as an unending and unbreakable relationship. A relationship that begins before the dawn of creation and will endure forever. When stories of violence and conflict surround us, we turn and see that God is about creation, not destruction, and in the business of making meaning in the midst of suffering. In all these ways, the God we are called to believe in pushes back against the tide of petty and myopic thinking. Our admittedly, occasionally Byzantine ideas about God remind us, no, actually, they require us to see the world differently. We are offered a vision of the world that is constructed on trust and hope, shown a world that is relational and compassionate. The project all along, through all of Scripture and in the theological conjuring of the Trinity, has been to tell stories and to craft poetry that will open our eyes to the moreness of God and thus the moreness of our lives, to lift up our gaze to see beyond the small scale of our own plans and way beyond the crafty machinations of those who need us to be anxious and malleable. The challenge of believing in the Trinity is not figuring out the formula. The challenge of believing in the Trinity is living a life that reflects this beautiful understanding of God as more than we can grasp or imagine, and of living a life that reflects that God is intrinsically a dynamic relationship that won't be pinned in or pinned down. This means that we will be dared to live not hunkered down and closed off, but with arms and hearts open to possibility and minds open to mystery and curiosity. We are confronted with a voluminous array of images and ideas about God. And God encompasses all of these and still more. If then, we also believe that we are somehow connected and created in the image of this kind of multifaceted God, then we are presented with yet another challenge: to allow ourselves to be more, and to recall that the stories of those around us are not reducible to flat caricatures either. We are called fundamentally into relationships that will be messy and necessary and unpredictable and might open us up in ways that are uncomfortable and demanding. And y'all, this is all much more difficult to manage than any old algebra problem about 3 persons and 1 identity. It's clunky, this Trinity of ours. And in a way, that might just be the point. In the same way that when Moses asked for God's name, Moses received a cumbersome combination of letters that kind of spelled, "I am who I am." And in the same way that anyone who asked Jesus a relatively straightforward question got a long and winding story for an answer. In a time and place like ours, addicted as we are to a strange soup of sound bites and fear-mongering, we get the opposite from the story of our faith. Rather than quips and bumper sticker slogans, what is on offer here is a rather impenetrable puzzle that points always toward open-hearted relationships. Since the very beginning, and all through Scripture and in the witness of our faith over the century, there have been voices pushing the boundaries of our imaginations to keep alive this unwieldy hope and to stoke some inconvenient love and courage in a world that has actually always felt a little bit like a doom spiral. All along, we've been trying to believe in more, even when the world tells us to expect less. And this is the beauty and the delight of our ungainly and unmanageable God, who is quite unsensibly, always and simply more.